They say that family is supposed to be your safe harbor in a cruel and unforgiving world, a place where you are loved unconditionally and protected from the storms of life. But for as long as I can remember, my family was the storm, and my childhood home was the very place I needed to be rescued from. My name is Maya, and for the first 18 years of my life, I was the invisible daughter, a ghost haunting the hallways of a beautiful, pristine suburban house that never actually felt like a home to me. My parents, Richard and Margaret, were obsessed with appearances, social status, and the illusion of absolute perfection, and in their eyes, their perfect world only had room for one child, my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was the golden child, the miracle baby born 3 years after me, and from the moment she took her first breath, my existence was completely and utterly erased from my parents' hearts. Chloe had the perfect blonde hair, the perfect porcelain smile, and the innate ability to manipulate my parents with a single, practiced tear. While Chloe's childhood was a continuous parade of expensive ballet lessons, custom-made designer dresses, lavish birthday parties with 50 guests, and constant, suffocating praise, my life was a quiet, agonizing blur of hand-me-down clothes, skipped meals, and endless chores. I was treated less like a daughter and more like an unpaid, live-in maid whose only purpose was to make sure Chloe's life was as comfortable and flawless as possible. I remember being 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen island until 2 in the morning, scrubbing the mud off Chloe's expensive designer sneakers because she had a fashion show the next day, while my own school shoes had holes in the soles that let the freezing winter rain seep into my socks. If I ever dared to complain or ask for something for myself, my mother would look at me with a cold, disgusted expression that made my blood run cold, telling me that I was selfish, ungrateful, and a financial burden on the family. She would constantly remind me that I was plain, that I lacked Chloe's natural charm and brilliance, and that I needed to work twice as hard just to be considered tolerable. My father was no better. He was a silent, enabling shadow who only ever spoke to me to criticize my grades or tell me to stay out of Chloe's way when she had her rich friends over. I tried so incredibly hard to win their love. I poured every ounce of my energy into my academics, staying up late to study under the dim light of my closet so I wouldn't wake Chloe, who demanded absolute silence. I graduated high school as the valedictorian with a perfect 4 GPA, earning a full academic scholarship to a prestigious state university, thinking that finally, my parents would look at me with an ounce of pride. But on the day of my high school graduation, my parents didn't even show up to the ceremony. They skipped the most important day of my life because Chloe had a minor, entirely optional cheerleading practice, and my mother claimed that Chloe needed emotional support more than I needed an audience. I walked across that stage, holding my diploma, looking out into a sea of cheering families, and felt a crushing, agonizing loneliness that threatened to swallow me whole. I realized then that no amount of perfection, no amount of hard work, and no amount of quiet suffering would ever make them love me. But the true, ultimate betrayal, the day that shattered my soul and simultaneously forged it into unbreakable steel, was my 18th birthday. I had spent the entire week cleaning the house from top to bottom, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my mother would bake me a cake or my father would offer a quiet, happy birthday over breakfast. Instead, I woke up on the morning of my 18th birthday to the sound of heavy footsteps outside my bedroom door. I opened the door to find my mother standing there with 3 black trash bags, tossing my meager belongings into them with a look of frantic, joyful relief. I stood there, frozen in shock, as she coldly informed me that since I was legally an adult, they were no longer financially or legally obligated to harbor a failure in their home. She told me that Chloe needed my bedroom to expand her walk-in closet for her upcoming college wardrobe, and that my presence was bringing down the energy of the household. My father stood at the bottom of the stairs, holding the front door open, not making a single sound of protest as my mother shoved the trash bags into my arms and practically pushed me down the steps. I begged them, tears streaming down my face, telling them I had nowhere to go, no savings, and that my college dorms didn't open for another 2 months. My mother just laughed, a dry, cruel sound that still echoes in my nightmares, and told me that it wasn't her problem. She looked me dead in the eyes and said the words that would become the fuel for the rest of my life. You are a worthless, plain, pathetic failure, Maya. You will never amount to anything, and we are finally done carrying your dead weight. Do not ever come back here." The heavy oak door slammed shut in my face, and the deadbolt clicked with a finality that echoed through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. I spent my 18th birthday sitting on a cold, wet park bench in the pouring rain, clutching 3 trash bags containing my entire life, sobbing until I couldn't breathe. I slept in a 24-hour laundromat that night, shivering in my damp clothes, feeling a level of despair that words cannot even begin to describe. But as the sun rose the next morning, casting a pale, cold light through the dirty windows of the laundromat, the agonizing pain in my chest slowly began to harden into something else. It hardened into a cold, focused, and absolutely relentless determination. They had called me a worthless failure, and they had thrown me away like garbage so my sister could have more space for her shoes. I made a silent vow to myself right there on that hard plastic chair. I was going to survive, I was going to thrive, and I was going to build an empire so massive and so undeniable that one day, they would be forced to look up from their shallow, pathetic lives and realize exactly who they had thrown away. The next 7 years of my life were a grueling, exhausting, and completely isolated journey through pure survival. I moved into a tiny, roach-infested studio apartment with 3 roommates, working 70 hours a week waitressing at a diner and scrubbing toilets at a local gym just to save enough money to eat while attending my university classes full-time. I didn't go to parties, I didn't buy new clothes, and I didn't make friends. I existed solely to prove them wrong. By the time I graduated with honors and a degree in finance, I had saved up $20,000 by living on rice and beans. While my classmates were taking entry-level corporate jobs, I took a massive risk. I used every single penny of my savings as a down payment on a dilapidated, foreclosed duplex in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I spent my nights and weekends teaching myself how to lay flooring, fix plumbing, and paint walls through online tutorials, tearing my hands to shreds to renovate that building. A year later, I sold it for double what I paid, and the empire officially began. Over the next 6 years, I flipped houses, bought commercial properties, and established a private real estate investment firm under an anonymous LLC named Phoenix Holdings. By the time I was 25, the invisible, worthless daughter was a self-made multimillionaire, living in a beautiful penthouse overlooking the city, driving a car my parents could never afford, and commanding a portfolio of luxury properties across the entire state. Meanwhile, the universe had a very different plan for Richard and Margaret. Through my network of high-end realtors and financial contacts, I kept a quiet, distant eye on my toxic family. It turned out that my parents' obsession with keeping up appearances had finally caught up with them. My father had made a series of disastrous, arrogant investments, trying to fund Chloe's absurdly expensive lifestyle, which included a failed luxury handbag business and a string of elite, unpaid internships that cost a fortune in rent and travel. Their massive, pristine suburban house had been quietly foreclosed on by the bank, their luxury cars were repossessed, and they were desperately drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt. But even in the face of total financial ruin, their ego remained their biggest priority. They couldn't bear the thought of their rich country club friends finding out they were broke, so they hatched a desperate plan. They decided to sell off the last of my mother's inherited jewelry to scrape together enough cash for a 1-year, upfront lease on a luxury rental property in the most exclusive gated community in the city. They wanted to pretend they were just downsizing, by choice, while secretly hoping Chloe would marry a rich heir to save them. They spent weeks touring high-end rentals, looking for a house grand enough to maintain their fake, wealthy facade. And that is exactly when the universe handed me the ultimate, poetic opportunity for absolute destruction. My lead property manager called me one afternoon to tell me that a family named the Harrisons had just submitted an urgent, desperate application to rent one of our newly acquired, ultra-luxury estates in the Whispering Pines community. They were offering to pay the entire year's rent in cash up front to bypass the strict background checks, because their credit scores were completely destroyed. When I saw the names on the application, Richard, Margaret, and Chloe Harrison, my heart completely stopped, and then a slow, dark, and incredibly satisfying smile spread across my face. They had absolutely no idea that the massive, anonymous corporation that owned the $6 million mansion they were begging to live in was solely owned by the daughter they had thrown into the street like garbage 7 years ago. I didn't reject their application. I didn't have my manager expose their bad credit. Instead, I personally approved the lease, intentionally waiving the standard protections and locking them into a terrifyingly strict, iron-clad 10-year contract filled with hidden financial traps, exorbitant penalty fees for the slightest property damage, and a non-negotiable eviction clause that gave the landlord absolute, dictatorial power over their living situation. They excitedly signed the paperwork, completely blinded by their desperation to look rich, legally chaining themselves to a financial bomb that I held the detonator for. They thought they had found their salvation and successfully hidden their shame from the world. They thought they were moving into a palace. They had absolutely no idea that they had just willingly walked into a customized, inescapable prison designed by the very person they had once called a worthless failure. The invisible daughter wasn't just surviving anymore. I was the landlord of their entire existence, and I was about to teach them exactly what it feels like to be completely, utterly powerless. The morning my toxic family officially moved into my $6 million luxury estate was a Tuesday, and I had intentionally cleared my entire schedule, sitting alone in the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of my high-rise penthouse office, with 3 massive, curved monitors glowing brightly on my custom marble desk. As the CEO of Phoenix Holdings, I had access to a state-of-the-art, high-definition smart security system that I had personally designed and installed across all my ultra-luxury rental properties, originally intended to protect the expensive assets. But today, it was serving as my own private theater of absolute justice. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the warm ceramic mug against my palms, a stark contrast to the freezing, calloused hands I used to have when I was scrubbing floors to survive 7 years ago. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, under the cover of early twilight, a cheap, dented, rented moving truck slowly rolled up the pristine, imported Italian cobblestone driveway of the Whispering Pines estate. The sheer irony of the situation was almost too delicious to comprehend. My parents, who had spent my entire childhood obsessed with their flawless public image and high society country club status, were sneaking into their new rental house before the sun came up just so their wealthy new neighbors wouldn't see that they couldn't afford professional, high-end luxury movers. I zoomed in on the high-resolution exterior camera feed and watched as my father, Richard, stepped out of the driver's side of the truck. He looked completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had watched me get thrown into the street on my 18th birthday. The last 7 years of hiding a crushing mountain of secret debt had aged him by 2 decades. His once perfect posture was hunched beneath the invisible weight of his financial ruin. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and visibly outdated, and the thick, dark hair he used to obsess over was now thinning and completely gray. A moment later, my mother, Margaret, stepped out of the passenger side, clutching a fake designer handbag to her chest like a life preserver. Even through the digital feed, I could see the thick layer of expensive makeup she had slathered on her face to hide the deep, exhausted lines of constant panic. She immediately started frantically barking orders at my father, pointing her perfectly manicured finger toward the grand, double oak front doors, treating him with the exact same harsh, dismissive cruelty she used to reserve entirely for me. And then, finally, my younger sister Chloe emerged from the back of the truck, stepping onto my driveway wearing a ridiculous, oversized pair of designer sunglasses in the dark, holding a tiny, shivering teacup poodle in one hand and an iced coffee in the other. She hadn't changed a single bit. At 22 years old, she was still the exact same spoiled, entitled, utterly useless parasite she had been when she was 15, completely oblivious to the fact that her parents had literally bankrupted themselves and sold their last family heirlooms just to keep a roof over her perfectly highlighted head. I turned up the volume on the exterior audio receivers and listened as Chloe immediately started whining in a shrill, piercing voice, complaining that the humidity of the early morning air was ruining her expensive blowout, and demanding that her father carry her 12 heavy, pink luxury suitcases up the stairs because she didn't want to break a nail. My mother rushed to comfort her, cooing over her like a fragile infant, promising her that this new mansion was the perfect place for her to host parties and finally attract a billionaire husband who could take care of them properly. I felt a dark, cold knot tighten in my chest. 7 years of brutal survival, 7 years of eating rice and beans, crying myself to sleep in roach-infested apartments, and bleeding for every single dollar I earned. And they were still the exact same shallow, pathetic monsters who believed the world owed them everything just for existing. I watched as they unlocked the front door using the digital keypad code my property manager had provided, stepping into the grand, 2-story marble foyer of the estate. The interior cameras tracked their every move as they wandered through the massive, sun-drenched living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows, the custom chef's kitchen with its imported quartz countertops, and the sweeping, theatrical staircase that led to the master suites. I watched my mother run her hands over the expensive fixtures, a look of desperate, manic greed flashing in her eyes as she turned to my father and loudly declared that this house was absolutely perfect for their redemption plan. She explicitly laid out her strategy, caught perfectly on my hidden microphones, instructing my father and Chloe that they were going to tell all their country club friends and extended family members that they had outright purchased this $6 million estate in cash. She laughed, a harsh, grating sound, claiming that no one would ever suspect they were actually completely broke and renting the property on a desperate, iron-clad lease that had drained the absolute last of their liquid assets. Chloe squealed with delight, running up the stairs to claim the largest, most luxurious guest suite that overlooked the private pool, casually tossing her heavy, metal-studded designer luggage directly onto the rare, imported Brazilian cherry hardwood floors that I had personally selected and paid $20,000 to have installed. But the moment that truly solidified my absolute lack of mercy came just a few minutes later, while they were standing in the kitchen, unpacking a box of cheap, mismatched plates that they were trying to pass off as antique china. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, and muttered that he hoped this insane financial risk was going to pay off, because if they missed even a single month of the exorbitant rent, the anonymous landlord's contract clearly stated they would be subjected to immediate, ruthless eviction and crushing legal penalties. My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively, and said the words that sealed their fate forever. "Oh, stop worrying, Richard. We are the Harrisons. We always find a way to land on our feet. Honestly, looking at this gorgeous kitchen, the only thing that would ruin the aesthetic of this perfect new life would be if that worthless, pathetic failure Maya ever showed up to beg us for money. Thank God we threw that trash out when we did. She would have dragged us down into the gutter with her." I sat back in my penthouse, watching the screen, my hands trembling not from sadness, but from a rage so pure and concentrated it felt like absolute ice in my veins. They were standing inside a fortress that I had built with my own 2 hands, breathing the air conditioned by the HVAC system I owned, walking on the floors I had paid for, and they were still calling me worthless trash. It was time to pull the very first string of the web I had woven around them. I picked up my secure, encrypted business phone and called my lead property manager, Mr. Vance, a highly professional, terrifyingly strict former corporate lawyer who handled all the brutal tenant enforcement for Phoenix Holdings and who knew exactly who I was and what this specific family meant to me. I instructed Mr. Vance to immediately review the exterior camera footage from the driveway. Chloe's leased, heavily scratched luxury SUV, which my father had driven up behind the moving truck, had a cracked oil pan. It was actively leaking thick, black, corrosive motor oil directly onto the porous, imported Italian cobblestones of my driveway, a direct, explicit violation of Section 4, Clause 12 of the specialized lease agreement my parents had signed without reading. I told Mr. Vance to execute the penalty protocol immediately. Less than 15 minutes later, while my family was still celebrating their fake wealth in the kitchen, my father's cell phone rang. I watched on the screen as he answered it, putting it on speakerphone, assuming it was the movers returning with the rest of their junk. Instead, the cold, unforgiving, professional voice of Mr. Vance echoed through the kitchen. He didn't introduce himself with polite pleasantries. He immediately informed Richard Harrison that the property management company's daily automated security sweep had detected a hazardous, unauthorized chemical leak on the estate's imported driveway caused by an unregistered vehicle. Mr. Vance calmly stated that, per the iron-clad lease agreement they had signed, this constituted severe property damage and triggered an immediate, non-negotiable hazardous cleanup penalty fee of exactly $5,000, payable via certified bank transfer within 24 hours. If the fee was not received by 8:00 a.m. the following morning, the contract authorized Phoenix Holdings to initiate an immediate 48-hour emergency eviction protocol, seize their entire upfront yearly rent deposit as punitive damages, and file a public lawsuit that would destroy whatever was left of their fragile credit score. The blood instantly drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He started stammering, his voice cracking with sheer panic, begging Mr. Vance to be reasonable, claiming it was just a few drops of oil and that they had literally just moved in. My mother started screaming in the background, demanding to speak to the owner of the company, shouting that they were elite members of society and would not be extorted by some low-level management clerk. Mr. Vance didn't even raise his voice. He simply stated, "Ma'am, Phoenix Holdings does not negotiate with tenants who violate the lease on day one. The owner of this property requires absolute perfection from the occupants. You have 23 hours and 50 minutes remaining. I strongly suggest you find the money, or I suggest you start packing your boxes again." He hung up the phone, leaving a deafening, suffocating silence in the kitchen. I watched through the cameras as my mother collapsed into a bar stool, putting her head in her hands and sobbing hysterically, realizing that the perfect redemption plan was already turning into a terrifying financial hostage situation. My father turned to Chloe, his face red with unprecedented anger, and actually yelled at her for the first time in his life, blaming her stupid, broken car for ruining them on the very first day. Chloe burst into dramatic, victimized tears, screaming that she hated this house and hated them, before running upstairs and slamming her bedroom door so hard the walls shook. I sat in my penthouse, watching the total, pathetic collapse of my toxic family over a single $5,000 penalty fee, a fee that I could have paid with the loose change in my purse. They thought they had escaped their ruin by hiding in a rich neighborhood, but they had absolutely no idea that they had willingly locked themselves inside a beautifully gilded glass cage, and that the worthless daughter they had thrown away was the one holding the remote control to every single aspect of their miserable lives. I smiled, took another sip of my coffee, and opened my calendar. The $5,000 fine was just a tiny, playful warning shot. The real psychological torture hadn't even begun, and I was going to stretch this out for as long as possible, letting them slowly suffocate under the weight of their own arrogance until they were completely, utterly broken. The 24 hours following Mr. Vance's terrifying phone call were an absolute masterclass in watching a toxic family eat themselves alive from the inside out, and I witnessed every single agonizing second of it through the high-definition lenses of my hidden security cameras, sitting comfortably in my penthouse with a feeling of cold, detached satisfaction. My father, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarch persona, spent the entire night packing the imported hardwood floors of the living room, frantically making hushed, desperate phone calls to every single sketchy financial contact he had left, trying to secure a $5,000 microloan with interest rates that bordered on criminal extortion. Meanwhile, my mother and Chloe engaged in a vicious, screaming argument in the master suite that echoed through the empty, cavernous halls of the mansion, with my mother demanding that Chloe sell one of her limited-edition designer handbags to cover the penalty fee, and Chloe throwing an absolute, hysterical tantrum, screaming that she would rather die than part with her luxury accessories because she needed them to impress the wealthy heirs at the country club. Eventually, around 4:00 a.m., my father managed to pawn his prized vintage Rolex watch, the very same watch he used to proudly tap whenever he told me I was wasting his valuable time during my childhood, for a fraction of its true value just to wire the funds to Phoenix Holdings mere hours before the eviction protocol was set to trigger. But instead of taking this terrifying financial near-death experience as a wake-up call to humble themselves and live quietly, My mother's narcissistic delusion kicked into absolute overdrive. The very next afternoon, I listened through the kitchen audio feed as Margaret furiously slammed a stack of thick, gold-embossed envelopes onto the quartz countertop, announcing to a visibly exhausted Richard that they were going to host a massive, lavish, housewarming gala by the end of the month. She explicitly stated that the only way to recover their social standing and find a rich husband for Chloe was to invite the top 50 most influential, elite members of the Whispering Pines Country Club to their new estate, firmly intending to look them dead in the eyes and lie through her teeth, claiming that they had purchased the $6 million property in cash. When my father weakly protested, pointing out that they literally had less than $800 left in their checking account to buy groceries, my mother simply scoffed, a sound dripping with pure, unadulterated venom, and declared that she had already secretly opened 3 new high-interest credit cards in Chloe's name to fund the catering, the champagne, and a live string quartet. What Margaret completely failed to realize, in her frantic obsession with maintaining her fake wealthy image, was that she was blindly ignoring Section 8, Clause 3 of the specialized lease agreement she had signed. A strict, non-negotiable prohibition against hosting any gathering of more than 15 people without prior written consent from the landlord, and a mandatory $50,000 event insurance deposit. She was willingly, enthusiastically walking right into the second trap of my design. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched the chaotic, pathetic preparations unfold like a slow-motion car crash. I saw my mother berating underpaid floral arrangers, demanding luxury arrangements while aggressively haggling over pennies. I watched Chloe strut around the house in a ridiculously expensive new silk gown she had bought on credit, practicing her fake, breathy laugh in the hallway mirrors, preparing to manipulate whichever wealthy bachelor walked through the doors. And as the night of the gala finally arrived, I made a decision that would alter the course of their miserable lives forever. I wasn't just going to sit in my penthouse and watch the disaster on a screen. I was going to attend. I was no longer the bruised, exhausted, invisible 18-year-old girl shivering in a laundromat wearing hand-me-down clothes. I was a 25-year-old self-made multimillionaire, the anonymous CEO of the very company that owned the ground they were standing on, and it was time to let them see the ghost they had created. I spent the evening getting ready with a meticulous, icy focus. I wore a stunning, custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that cost more than my parents' entire remaining net worth, paired with understated but breathtaking diamond earrings and a pair of sleek, deadly stilettos that announced my presence with every step. My hair, which my mother used to call frizzy and unmanageable, was professionally styled into sleek, elegant waves, and my makeup was a flawless armor of high society perfection. When I pulled my matte black, custom sports car up to the valet stand at my own rental property, the sheer, poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. The estate was completely illuminated, the massive chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow across the front lawn, where a live string quartet was playing classical music for a crowd of 60 elite, wealthy guests holding crystal champagne flutes. I walked through the grand double doors, blending seamlessly into the sea of high fashion and old money, feeling the familiar, heavy scent of expensive perfumes and arrogant entitlement in the air. It didn't take long for me to spot my mother. Margaret was standing near the grand staircase, holding court with a group of older, wealthy socialites, wearing a forced, dazzling smile that didn't quite reach her panicked, exhausted eyes. I slowly made my way through the crowd, deliberately positioning myself directly in her line of sight, just as she was loudly boasting to a prominent city judge about how they had snatched up this gorgeous property in an all-cash deal just to have a better view of the lake. The exact moment Margaret's eyes landed on me, the arrogant, boasting words completely died in her throat. I watched the blood drain from her face with such velocity that I genuinely thought she might faint on the imported hardwood. She blinked rapidly, her eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror as she tried to reconcile the image of the worthless, discarded daughter she had thrown into the trash with the breathtaking, undeniably wealthy woman standing across the room holding a glass of vintage champagne. Her survival instincts, honed by decades of social manipulation, kicked in immediately. She excused herself from the judge with a frantic, shaky laugh, practically sprinting across the room toward me. Before I could even say a word, Her manicured fingers dug brutally into my bare arm, her acrylic nails biting into my skin with the same abusive force she had used when I was a child. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I had survived the last 7 years. She dragged me violently out of the main living room, pushing me through the swinging doors into the catering pantry, where the noise of the party was muffled by the thick walls. The moment the doors swung shut, her fake socialite mask completely shattered, revealing the ugly, cruel monster I remembered so vividly. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of sheer panic and vicious rage, her eyes frantically scanning my expensive gown as if trying to calculate who I had stolen it from. "How did you find this address? Who let you in? Are you catering? Are you part of the staff?" "Listen to me, you worthless little parasite. We are hosting the most important people in the city tonight, and I will not let your pathetic, miserable presence ruin Chloe's chances at a decent life. You need to go out the back door, right now, before your father sees you and has you arrested for trespassing." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't revert back to the terrified teenager who used to beg for her approval. I just stood there, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, freezing pity. I gently but firmly grabbed her wrist, peeling her claw-like fingers off my arm with a terrifying, calm strength that made her step back in shock. "I'm not catering, Margaret," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing with unshakable authority. "And I certainly didn't sneak in. I was invited by someone who actually matters in this city. I just wanted to see how you were treating the place." My mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh, rolling her eyes with absolute disgust. "Invited? You? Don't make me sick, Maya. You are a nobody. You have always been a nobody. You probably slept your way into a +1 invitation just to come here and beg us for a handout. Well, we don't have any spare change for you. We own this $6 million estate now, and you are nothing but a stain on my family's reputation." Before she could hurl another insult, the pantry doors swung open, and the heavy, booming voice of Arthur Sterling, a billionaire real estate developer and one of my most lucrative private investment partners, filled the small room. Arthur wasn't just a guest. He was one of the most feared and respected men in the local elite. He looked right past my mother, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile as he extended his hand toward me. "Maya." "My God, I was hoping you would make an appearance tonight. I was just telling the mayor about that phenomenal $30 million commercial plaza acquisition your firm closed last week. You are an absolute shark, my dear, the sharpest mind in Phoenix Holdings." The silence that fell over the pantry was so thick, so heavy, that it felt like the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. My mother froze, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between Arthur's respectful, admiring expression and my calm, amused face. Her brain was completely short-circuiting, desperately trying to process the impossible reality that the billionaire real estate titan was speaking to her discarded daughter as an equal, praising her for closing multi-million-dollar deals. "Phoenix Holdings." Margaret whispered, the name of her anonymous, terrifying landlord falling from her lips like a curse, though her arrogant mind was still too dense to make the ultimate connection that I owned the company. She simply assumed I was a high-level executive working for them. "Maya works for Phoenix Holdings," Arthur laughed, clapping me on the shoulder with genuine respect. "Works for them? Margaret, Maya doesn't just work for them. She is the founder. She is a self-made titan. She's the reason half of us are making a profit this quarter." Margaret literally staggered backward, bumping into a metal prep table, her face turning a sickly shade of ash gray. The daughter she had called a failure, the child she had thrown into the street, was a multi-millionaire standing in her rented house, wearing a dress worth more than her remaining life savings. But the absolute, devastating climax of the evening hadn't even arrived yet. Just as my mother was struggling to breathe, the heavy, imposing figure of Mr. Vance, my lead property manager, strode into the kitchen, flanked by 2 uniformed, off-duty police officers he had hired as private security. Mr. Vance didn't look at my mother. He looked directly at me, giving a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of respect to his boss, before turning his cold, dead eyes to Margaret Harrison. He pulled a thick, red-stamped legal document from his tailored suit jacket, his voice carrying clearly into the main hallway where several wealthy guests had stopped to watch the commotion. "Margaret Harrison," Mr. Vance announced, his voice devoid of any human empathy. As the legal representative of the property owner, I am officially serving you with a severe lease violation notice. Section 8, Clause 3 explicitly prohibits unauthorized gatherings of more than 15 individuals. Our security logs indicate you currently have over 60 people on the premises. Consequently, you are being issued an immediate, non-negotiable penalty fine of $25,000 for unauthorized commercial liability risk. The gasps from the wealthy guests lingering near the door were audible. The illusion was completely shattered. The entire country club elite had just heard the terrifying representative of the landlord declare that the Harrisons didn't own the house, that they were merely renters, and that they were currently in violation of a strict lease. My mother let out a choked, desperate sob, her hands trembling violently as she took the legal paper, realizing that she didn't have $25,000, that her social reputation was permanently destroyed in front of the most important people in the city, and that the only person in the room who had the money to save her from immediate eviction was the daughter she had just spent the last 5 minutes insulting in a pantry. I looked at her, my face a mask of absolute, chilling serenity. I didn't gloat, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply gave her a polite, devastatingly cold nod, linked my arm through the billionaire investor's arm, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving my toxic mother to drown in the shallow, pathetic puddle of her own shattered ego. The housewarming gala was officially a funeral for her pride, and the $25,000 noose I had just slipped around her neck was going to force her to do the one thing she feared more than death. She was going to have to crawl on her hands and knees to the worthless failure and beg for her life. The devastating silence that blanketed the Whispering Pines estate the morning after the disastrously aborted housewarming gala was not the peaceful quiet of a luxury home, but the suffocating, heavy silence of a tomb where my parents' carefully constructed social lives had just been brutally and publicly executed. I sat in the dim, early morning light of my penthouse, nursing a cup of green tea while my eyes remained glued to the high-definition security feeds, watching the frantic, pathetic aftermath of their total humiliation. The wealthy, elite country club friends they had desperately tried to impress had not just left the party early. They had fled the property the moment Mr. Vance announced the $25,000 lease violation, treating my parents like they had suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. In the high society world my mother worshipped, there was absolutely no sin greater than pretending to be wealthy while secretly being a broke, desperate renter facing imminent eviction. Through the kitchen audio feed, I listened to the raw, unhinged sound of my mother packing the imported tile floor, her voice hoarse from a night of hysterical crying, while my father sat at the island with his head buried in his hands, looking like a man who had finally realized he was standing at the edge of a bottomless cliff. The $25,000 penalty was due in less than 48 hours, and they had absolutely exhausted every single hidden credit card, pawned every last piece of jewelry, and burned every bridge they had ever built. Chloe, true to her entirely useless, parasitic nature, wasn't helping. She was locked in her upstairs bedroom, sobbing loudly because two of the wealthy heirs she had been flirting with at the party had already blocked her on all social media platforms after witnessing her family's disgraceful public unmasking. It was in this exact moment of absolute, crushing despair that my mother's toxic, manipulative survival instincts kicked into their highest, most sickening gear. I watched as Margaret suddenly stopped packing, her tear-stained, makeup-smeared face hardening into a look of cold, calculating desperation. She turned to my broken father and articulated a plan so deeply hypocritical and utterly shameless that it actually made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment. She declared, with a terrifyingly straight face, that since I was clearly a multimillionaire executive at Phoenix Holdings, I had a moral and familial obligation to bail them out of this crisis. She actually managed to convince herself, in real time, that the 7 years of brutal silence, the fact that she had thrown me out in the rain on my 18th birthday with my belongings in garbage bags, and the vicious insults she had hurled at me in the catering pantry just 12 hours prior, were all just minor family misunderstandings that could easily be swept under the rug with a motherly hug and a fake apology. She instructed Richard to put on his best, most respectable suit, and declared that they were going to my corporate office to remind me of the unbreakable bond of family. At exactly 11:00 a.m., the receptionist at the sprawling, glass-and-steel downtown headquarters of Phoenix Holdings buzzed my private office, her voice laced with professional confusion, informing me that a Mr. and Mrs. Harrison were in the lobby, frantically demanding an urgent audience with the CEO, claiming to be my beloved parents. I didn't send them away, and I didn't make it easy for them. I instructed my assistant to let them sit in the cold, intimidating, ultra-modern waiting area for exactly 2 agonizing hours, letting them stew in their own mounting panic while they stared at the massive, glowing corporate logo of the company that was currently holding their lives hostage. When I finally authorized their entry, I was seated at the head of a massive, 30-foot polished obsidian conference table, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding, breathtaking view of the entire city skyline, a visual representation of the absolute power I now held over them. When the heavy mahogany doors swung open, Margaret and Richard stepped into the room, their eyes wide with a mixture of sheer awe and absolute terror at the undeniable scale of my wealth. My mother immediately attempted to launch into her rehearsed performance. She rushed toward me with her arms outstretched, a sickening, watery smile plastered across her face, crying out my name as if I were a long-lost soldier returning from war. I didn't stand up. I didn't smile. I simply raised a single manicured finger, pointing to the 2 empty chairs positioned at the absolute furthest end of the massive table, a physical distance of 20 feet that mirrored the emotional chasm between us. "Sit down, Margaret," I said, my voice echoing through the cavernous boardroom with the cold, unyielding authority of a judge addressing a convicted criminal. The false, maternal warmth instantly drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of the old, vicious anger, but her desperation forced her to swallow her pride. She and my father took their seats, looking impossibly small and pathetic in the oversized, leather executive chairs. My mother cleared her throat, attempting to produce a few authentic-looking tears, and began to weave a tapestry of gaslighting and manipulation that was truly staggering to witness. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my success, claiming that she had always known I was a genius, and that her tough love when I was 18 was actually a brilliant, calculated parenting strategy designed to push me toward my true potential. She practically demanded that I thank her for throwing me into the street, completely rewriting the history of my agonizing, starving survival as a beautifully orchestrated character-building exercise. My father chimed in, using a soft, pleading tone he had never once used with me during my childhood, talking about how family must always stick together in times of trouble. I sat there, listening to their disgusting, transparent lies, feeling a profound sense of validation. They didn't love me. They loved my bank account. They were looking at me not as a daughter, but as an ATM machine that had miraculously materialized to save them from the consequences of their own arrogance. When they finally exhausted their fake apologies and asked for a temporary family loan of $25,000 to cover the lease penalty, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold obsidian table, and stared directly into my mother's eyes. "You threw me away like garbage so Chloe could have a bigger closet," I said, my voice dangerously soft, stripping away every ounce of their fake narrative in a single sentence. "You watched me cry in the rain and you laughed, and now you sit in my building, breathing my air, asking for my money to save the fake, pathetic image you care about more than your own children. I am not going to give you a loan, Margaret. Phoenix Holdings is a business, and you have absolutely zero credit, zero income, and zero honor." My father buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched sob of total defeat, believing the eviction was now inevitable. My mother's face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage, and she opened her mouth to scream her usual barrage of insults, ready to curse my name just as she always had. But before she could speak, I raised my hand again, stopping her dead in her tracks. "However," I continued, watching her eyes widen with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope, "I am a businesswoman. I am willing to personally pay the $25,000 penalty to Phoenix Holdings on your behalf, effectively saving you from immediate eviction and total, public homelessness. But I do not lend money without collateral. Since you have absolutely no assets, no savings, and no property, there is only one thing of value left in that entire rented mansion." I pulled a legally binding. heavily notarized contract from my leather portfolio and slid it precisely down the length of the long table until it stopped directly in front of my mother. "Chloe's closet," I stated, watching the utter confusion and dawning horror wash over their faces. "Chloe has spent the last 5 years accumulating a massive collection of limited edition designer handbags, authentic diamond jewelry, and custom couture gowns, all funded by the debt that currently has a noose around your necks. I have had my appraisers review her social media posts. The total resale value of her collection is approximately $30,000. If you want my money to save your lease, you will sign this contract, legally transferring the full, uncontested ownership of every single designer item in Chloe's bedroom to my personal holding company. You will go home, you will pack it all into boxes, and you will deliver it to my loading dock by 5:00 p.m. today. If you do this, your fine is paid. If you do not, Mr. Vance will be at your door tomorrow morning with the police to physically remove you from the premises." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum of morality. I was presenting my mother with the ultimate, brutal psychological test. For my entire life, she had sacrificed my well-being, my happiness, and my basic human needs to ensure that Chloe had everything her spoiled heart desired. I was forcing Margaret to choose between her own survival and the material happiness of her precious golden child. I watched her hands tremble as she hovered over the document. My father looked at her, his eyes begging her not to do it, knowing the absolute, catastrophic psychological meltdown Chloe would have if her entire identity and status symbols were stripped away from her. But I knew Margaret Harrison better than anyone else in the world. I knew that beneath her fierce protection of Chloe was a deep, rotting core of absolute, selfish self-preservation. Margaret didn't hesitate for more than 30 seconds. She picked up the heavy, gold pen I had provided, signed her name on the dotted line without shedding a single tear, and legally sold out her favorite daughter's entire life just to save her own skin. She pushed the contract back across the table, grabbed her fake designer bag, and practically ran out of the boardroom without saying another word, leaving my broken father to shuffle out behind her like a defeated ghost. An hour later, sitting in the quiet comfort of my office, I pulled up the interior security feeds for the Whispering Pines estate, and I watched the absolute, chaotic destruction of my family's final bond. I watched my mother march into Chloe's bedroom with an armful of heavy-duty garbage bags. I listened through the audio feed as Chloe screamed in sheer, unadulterated agony, falling to her knees and begging my mother to stop as Margaret ruthlessly emptied the closets, tossing Chanel bags, diamond tennis bracelets, and custom silk gowns into the plastic bags like cheap trash. Chloe tried to physically block the door, crying that her life was over, that she couldn't show her face at the country club without her designer armor, but my mother violently shoved her golden child aside, screaming that they were about to be homeless and that Chloe needed to stop being so incredibly selfish. The poetic, agonizing beauty of the moment was almost overwhelming. My mother was finally treating Chloe with the exact same harsh, dismissive cruelty she had subjected me to for 18 years, and she was doing it using the exact same black garbage bags she had used to throw my belongings into the street. By 4:30 p.m., the boxes of luxury goods were delivered to my loading dock. The $25,000 penalty was officially marked as paid in the Phoenix holding system, and my family was granted a temporary, miserable reprieve from eviction. But as I watched Chloe lying on the floor of her empty closet, weeping inconsolably while my parents sat in the silent, tense living room refusing to speak to each other, I knew that the real victory wasn't the collateral. The real victory was that I had completely shattered the illusion of their perfect family dynamic. The golden child now hated the mother, the father was broken by the shame, and they were all trapped in a massive, beautiful mansion they couldn't afford, living in constant, suffocating fear of an anonymous landlord they didn't yet realize was the very daughter who was watching their every single move. The trap had closed, the poison of betrayal had been injected directly into their veins, and the long, agonizing winter of their discontent was only just beginning. The atmosphere inside the Whispering Pines estate over the next 3 weeks devolved from a tense, uncomfortable silence into a toxic, suffocating wasteland of absolute paranoia and bitter, unspoken hatred, proving once And for all that a family built entirely on a foundation of shallow materialism will instantly devour itself the moment the money disappears. From my vantage point in the penthouse, watching the high-definition security feeds, the sheer, agonizing misery of their daily existence was a symphony of poetic justice. Margaret and Chloe, who had spent my entire childhood operating as an inseparable, vicious team that made my life a living hell, were now locked in a vicious, silent Cold War. Chloe had not spoken a single word to her mother since the day her precious designer collection was ruthlessly stuffed into black garbage bags and hauled away. She spent her days wandering the massive, empty halls of the $6 million mansion like a hollow, glamorous ghost, wrapped in a cheap, fatting bathrobe, obsessively refreshing her social media feeds on a cracked smartphone, watching in pure agony as her former wealthy friends posted pictures from luxury yacht parties and elite country club brunches that she was no longer invited to. Without her expensive armor of Chanel bags, Cartier bracelets, and custom Prada gowns, Chloe's entire identity had evaporated into thin air. She realized, with crushing, inescapable clarity, that no one had ever actually liked her for her personality. They had only tolerated her for her perceived wealth, and now that the wealth was gone, she was nothing but a pathetic, invisible outcast. My father, Richard, had completely given up. He spent his evenings sitting alone in the dark, cavernous living room, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, staring blankly at the imported marble fireplace, fully realizing that he was legally chained to a 10-year lease he couldn't afford, living under the constant, terrifying threat of the anonymous corporate landlord who had already demonstrated a complete lack of mercy. But Chloe, driven to the absolute brink of insanity by her desperate, clawing need to reclaim her high society status, began to hatch a plan fueled by sheer, unadulterated entitlement and a complete disregard for the consequences. I watched her behavior shift on the cameras. She started staying up late, prowling the dark corridors of the house long after our parents had taken their sleeping pills and passed out in the master suite. She was looking for something, anything, that she could steal, pawn, or leverage to buy her way back into the elite circles she so desperately craved. Her desperate, manic eyes eventually landed on the one room in the entire estate that was strictly, legally forbidden to them. At the very end of the north wing, hidden behind a pair of heavy, solid mahogany doors secured by a state-of-the-art biometric deadbolt, was the owner's sanctuary, a private, climate-controlled executive office that Mr. Vance had explicitly told them was strictly off-limits under Section 9, Clause 2 of their lease, warning them that even attempting to open the door would trigger a catastrophic penalty. But Chloe, blinded by her own greed and the arrogant assumption that rules simply didn't apply to her, completely ignored the warning. On a Tuesday night, while a heavy, violent thunderstorm raged outside, casting sharp, jagged flashes of lightning through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched on my primary monitor as Chloe crept out of her bedroom carrying a heavy, iron crowbar she had taken from my father's emergency toolbox in the garage. She was wearing black sweatpants and a dark hoodie, looking like a common burglar in the very house she was supposed to be a guest in. I leaned forward in my plush leather chair, my heart beating with a cold, thrilling anticipation, and took a slow sip of my chamomile tea. I could have remotely engaged the secondary alarm system to scare her away. I could have called the police to have her arrested for attempted burglary. But I didn't do a single thing. I wanted her to break in. I had specifically designed that room for this exact moment, leaving a tiny, intentional flaw in the biometric lock's physical override mechanism, waiting for the rat to finally chew through the cage and walk directly into the ultimate psychological trap. I watched in crystal-clear night vision as Chloe jammed the heavy iron crowbar into the seam of the mahogany doors, grunting and straining with all her minimal strength, her face contorted in a mask of ugly, desperate greed. With a loud, echoing crack that was masked by a sudden clap of thunder outside, the door frame splintered, the lock gave way, and Chloe stumbled forward into the pitch-black sanctuary. I immediately accessed the room's hidden control panel from my laptop and gently, almost imperceptibly, raised the ambient lighting just enough for her to see the breathtaking, intimidating scale of the room. It wasn't a storage closet. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern executive command center, lined with dark cedar bookshelves, featuring a massive, polished obsidian desk in the absolute center. Chloe's eyes widened with greedy delight, assuming she had just broken into the anonymous billionaire landlord's secret vault, fully expecting to find stacks of emergency cash, bearer bonds, or expensive art that she could secretly smuggle out and sell. She practically ran to the obsidian desk, frantically yanking open the heavy drawers, tossing expensive stationery and leather-bound ledgers onto the floor with zero regard for the property. But there was no cash. There were no diamonds. There was only a single, sleek, black titanium lockbox sitting perfectly in the center of the bottom drawer. Chloe's hands were shaking as she pulled it out, setting it on the desk. To her surprise, the combination dial was already set to the open position, another breadcrumb I had intentionally left for her. She flipped the heavy metal latches, threw open the lid, and eagerly looked inside, her eyes wide with anticipation. But what she found inside the box didn't make her smile. It made the blood freeze in her veins and her breath hitch in her throat in a sudden, violent gasp of pure, paralyzing horror. Inside the box rested the original, gold-embossed founding charter of Phoenix Holdings, the multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerate that owned the house, owned their debt, and held their entire miserable future in its iron grip. And there, printed in bold, undeniable, perfectly clear black ink at the very top of the legal document, under the title of sole proprietor and chief executive officer, was a single name: Maya Harrison. Chloe stumbled backward, her trembling hands dropping the heavy document onto the desk as if it were coated in burning acid. She shook her head violently, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish, desperately trying to reject the impossible, universe-shattering reality that was staring her in the face. Her brain, conditioned for 18 years to view me as nothing more than worthless, invisible trash, completely short-circuited trying to process the fact that the terrifying, anonymous billionaire torturing them, the entity that had stripped her of her designer bags and humiliated her mother, was the very sister she had spent her entire life bullying. She reached back into the box with a shaking hand and pulled out a second item, a thick, glossy photograph album. She flipped it open, and her eyes widened as she saw high-definition, printed photographs of herself, her mother, and our father, taken from the hidden security cameras inside the house over the last 3 weeks. There were photos of my mother crying in the kitchen, photos of my father pawning his watch, and a horrifyingly clear, zoomed-in photograph of Chloe herself standing in her empty closet, weeping over her lost Chanel bags. She realized in that exact, terrifying second that they were not living in a luxury rental. They were living in a high-tech, psychological terrarium, and I had been watching, listening, and laughing at their misery every single minute of every single day. The illusion of her safety completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, naked, absolute terror. That was the exact moment I reached out and pressed the button to activate the two-way, high-fidelity intercom system hidden invisibly in the ceiling of the sanctuary. "You broke the lock, Chloe," my voice echoed through the dark room, amplified by the state-of-the-art speakers, sounding like the voice of a cold, vengeful god descending from the heavens. "That is a direct violation of Section 9, Clause 2, property damage, criminal trespass. I'm extremely disappointed, but honestly I am not surprised." Chloe screamed, a raw, guttural, terrifying sound of pure panic, and spun around in a frantic circle, her terrified eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, looking for the camera she knew was watching her but couldn't see. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. Maya, is that you? Oh my God. Oh my God, it's you. You did this. You set us up. You stole my things. You ruined my life." She wailed, tears streaming down her face, her profound, pathetic victim complex kicking in immediately. She didn't apologize. She didn't show remorse. She immediately tried to turn herself into the victim. "I'm going to tell Mom. I'm going to wake them up right now and tell them that you are the one doing this to us. They are going to sue you, Maya. You are a monster." I leaned back in my chair in the penthouse, taking another sip of my tea, completely unbothered by her pathetic threats. "Go ahead, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with icy, razor-sharp amusement. "Run upstairs. Wake them up. Show them the charter. Tell Margaret and Richard that the worthless failure they threw into the rain is the sole owner of the company that holds their 10-year, iron-clad lease. But before you do, you should probably know what happens the exact millisecond you open your mouth. If you tell them my secret tonight, I will press a single button on this keyboard, and Mr. Vance will arrive at 6:00 a.m. with the city police to arrest you for felony breaking and entering. I have you on camera, holding a crowbar, destroying my property. While you are sitting in a jail cell, I will immediately execute the emergency eviction protocol. Your parents will be thrown out onto the street by noon tomorrow, legally bankrupt, completely homeless, and utterly destroyed. And the best part, Margaret will know that the eviction happened because you couldn't control your greedy, thieving little fingers. She already hates you for costing her the housewarming gala. Imagine how much she will despise you when you are the reason she is sleeping in a cardboard box. The silence that followed my words was absolute, broken only by the sound of thunder rattling the windows and Chloe's ragged, hyperventilating breaths. The trap had successfully snapped shut, catching the golden child by the throat. She realized with crushing clarity that she was completely, hopelessly trapped. She couldn't tell our parents the truth without instantly destroying their lives and sending herself to prison, but she also couldn't unsee the terrifying reality that she was living inside a panopticon controlled by the sister she had tormented. She was holding a nuclear bomb of a secret, and she was forced to swallow it whole. What? What do you want from me? She finally whispered, her voice broken, defeated, and entirely devoid of the arrogant entitlement that had defined her entire existence. She was staring at the ceiling, tears dripping off her chin, waiting for my command. I want you to put the documents back exactly where you found them, I commanded, my voice cold and uncompromising. I want you to walk out of my sanctuary, close the broken doors, and go back to your room. And for the rest of your miserable time in my house, every time you look at Margaret, every time you look at Richard, you will carry the agonizing, terrifying knowledge that I am watching you, and that you are only breathing my air because I allow it. Now, get out of my office. I watched on the monitors as Chloe mechanically, numbly placed the charter back into the lockbox, closed the lid, and stumbled out of the room like a traumatized zombie. She didn't look back. She walked down the long, dark hallway, her spirit completely, utterly pulverized by the sheer weight of the psychological warfare I had just unleashed upon her. The golden child was finally broken, forced to live in silent, suffocating terror, serving as my secret, unwilling accomplice in the ultimate destruction of our toxic family. The first phase of the revenge was complete. The invisible daughter was now the omnipotent warden of the glass house, and the real torture of the Harrison family was about to reach an entirely new, terrifying level. The psychological devastation of discovering that the sister you spent your entire life tormenting is actually the omnipotent. Billionaire architect of your current living nightmare is not something a fragile, shallow mind like Chloe's could simply process and move on from. It was a realization that fundamentally broke her perception of reality, plunging her into a state of absolute, suffocating paranoia that was far more agonizing than any physical prison could ever be. In the days following her terrifying midnight breach of the owner's sanctuary, I sat in the serene, climate-controlled comfort of my penthouse, watching the high-definition security monitors as Chloe slowly lost her grip on her sanity. She became a twitchy, terrified ghost within the sprawling $6 million estate, constantly looking over her shoulder, her sunken, bloodshot eyes darting toward every smoke detector, every air conditioning vent, and every decorative mirror, acutely aware that my invisible eyes were tracking her every single move. She stopped sleeping entirely, terrified that if she closed her eyes, Mr. Vance and the city police would materialize in her bedroom to arrest her for the felony break-in. But the true masterpiece of this psychological torture was the absolute isolation I had forced upon her. She was carrying a nuclear secret, sharing a house with parents who were frantically trying to maintain a fake illusion of wealth, and she couldn't say a single word to warn them without triggering the immediate, catastrophic destruction of their entire family. But a toxic narcissist like my mother, Margaret, does not simply accept defeat, even when the walls are rapidly closing in around her. Stripped of her social standing after the disastrous, heavily penalized housewarming gala, Margaret's desperate, clawing need for money and status morphed into something dangerously brazen. Through the hidden kitchen microphones, I listened as Margaret laid out her newest, deeply illegal scheme to my broken, exhausted father. She had discovered through her remaining country club contacts that a highly lucrative underground luxury goods market existed for wealthy housewives who wanted to buy gently used designer items for cash to hide their spending from their husbands. Margaret, completely unhinged by her financial desperation, announced that she was going to host a private elite estate auction right there in the living room of my rental property. Her plan was to source cheap, high-quality counterfeit designer handbags and fake diamond jewelry from sketchy overseas distributors, invite a select group of wealthy, gullible socialites to the house, and pass the fakes off as authentic, vintage pieces from her own private collection, expecting to pocket tens of thousands of dollars in untraceable cash. Richard weakly begged her not to do it, warning her that passing off counterfeit luxury goods was a federal crime and a blatant violation of their lease's strict prohibition against running commercial enterprises on the property. But Margaret simply sneered at him, calling him a spineless coward, and declared that the anonymous landlord would never find out. She had absolutely no idea that the anonymous landlord was currently sitting 10 miles away, listening to her confess to a premeditated federal crime in real time, sipping an iced matcha latte. I could have easily called Mr. Vance, issued another massive penalty, or simply tipped off the authorities to have her arrested for fraud the moment the counterfeit bags arrived. But that would have been entirely too fast, too clean, and far too easy for a woman who had subjected me to 18 years of emotional abuse. Instead, I saw the perfect, poetic opportunity to use the newly broken golden child as my own personal instrument of vengeance. I waited until 2:00 a.m., when Margaret and Richard were fast asleep, and I triggered the encrypted, two-way intercom speaker hidden seamlessly inside the crown molding of Chloe's bedroom. "Wake up, Chloe," my voice whispered into the darkness, sharp and cold as a razor blade. I watched on the night vision feed as Chloe shot up in bed, gasping for air, her hands clutching the duvet to her chest, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Maya, please," she whimpered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely speak. "I haven't said anything, I swear. I haven't told them a single word. Please don't call the police." I didn't offer her an ounce of comfort. "I know you haven't told them, Chloe, because you are still sleeping in my house. But your mother is currently planning to commit felony fraud on my property by selling counterfeit luxury goods this weekend. I cannot allow my $6 million estate to be used as a staging ground for a cheap, pathetic scam. So you are going to stop her." Chloe let out a panicked, choked sob, violently shaking her head. No, you know I can't do that. She won't listen to me. She's obsessed with this plan. If I try to stop her, she'll be furious. Please, Maya, just cancel the lease, just kick us out, but don't make me fight her." The irony was overwhelmingly delicious. The golden child, who had happily watched our mother scream at me for years, was now begging to be evicted rather than face Margaret's wrath. "I am not asking you to negotiate with her, Chloe," I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "The counterfeit bags are being delivered tomorrow afternoon in 3 large, unmarked cardboard boxes. Margaret plans to hide them in the basement storage room until the auction on Saturday. Your instructions are simple. Tomorrow night, while your parents are asleep, you will go down to the basement. You will take a pair of heavy fabric scissors, and you will completely and irreversibly destroy every single fake handbag in those boxes. You will slice the leather, you will cut the straps, and you will shatter the fake hardware. If you do not completely destroy Margaret's inventory by 4:00 a.m. tomorrow, I will email the security footage of you breaking into my vault directly to the local precinct, and I will personally watch them drag you out of the house in handcuffs. Do we understand each other, little sister?" Chloe wept silently, her face buried in her hands, nodding frantically at the ceiling. She was completely trapped, forced to become the architect of her own mother's destruction just to save herself from a prison cell. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological tension. I watched the delivery driver drop off the illicit boxes, and I watched Margaret excitedly drag them down into the basement, locking the door and hiding the key in a ceramic vase in the kitchen. But Chloe, driven by the terrifying, omnipotent threat of my surveillance, was watching her too. At 3:00 a.m., the mansion was dead silent. I watched on the cameras as Chloe, looking like a condemned prisoner walking to the gallows, crept downstairs, retrieved the key, and unlocked the basement door. She was holding a large pair of heavy-duty kitchen shears. She opened the boxes, revealing dozens of incredibly convincing fake designer bags. For a girl whose entire life had revolved around the worship of luxury goods, destroying them, even fake ones, was a bizarre, twisted form of psychological torture. But the fear of my retaliation overrode her hesitation. I watched as she plunged the shears into the center of a fake Prada tote, slicing it wide open. She moved methodically, tears streaming down her face, violently cutting, slashing, and ripping every single piece of Margaret's illegal inventory to absolute shreds. When she was finished, the basement floor was covered in a thick layer of ruined synthetic leather, severed straps, and shattered faux gold hardware. She had completely, effectively neutralized the scam. She locked the door, put the key back, and retreated to her room, waiting for the inevitable explosion. That explosion arrived precisely at 9:00 a.m. the following morning, and it was glorious. I turned up the volume on my monitors as Margaret excitedly trotted down to the basement to inspect her fraudulent merchandise, entirely unaware of the devastation waiting for her. A moment later, a scream of pure, agonizing, earth-shattering rage echoed from the depths of the house, a sound so loud and full of venom it made my father drop his coffee mug in the kitchen. Margaret sprinted up the stairs, her face contorted into a mask of pure, demonic fury, holding a shredded, destroyed piece of fake leather in her shaking fist. She didn't blame Richard, and she didn't suspect an intruder. Her predatory instincts immediately locked onto the only other person in the house. She stormed upstairs, kicked Chloe's bedroom door open with terrifying force, and dragged her screaming daughter out of bed by the arm. "What did you do?" Margaret shrieked, her voice echoing through the massive estate, shoving the shredded bag into Chloe's terrified face. "What is wrong with you? I am trying to save this family. I am trying to put food on the table. And you destroyed the only chance we had left. Why would you do this?" Chloe, paralyzed by fear and unable to confess that she was acting under my omnipotent threats, could only stammer and cry, frantically shaking her head. "I didn't, Mom, I swear I didn't. Please, you have to believe me." But Margaret was completely blind with rage. The financial pressure, the humiliation, and the loss of her illegal payday culminated in a complete psychological snap. She looked at her precious golden child, the daughter she had worshipped and protected for 22 years, and unleashed a torrent of abuse so venomous and so chillingly familiar that it actually made the hair on my arms stand up. "You are completely useless," Margaret screamed, spittle flying from her lips, her eyes filled with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "I have sacrificed everything for you. I went into millions of dollars of debt to keep you dressed like a princess, and you repay me by destroying my only lifeline because you are a selfish, stupid, ungrateful parasite. You are nothing but a burden. I wish I had thrown you out instead of your sister. At least Maya had the brains to survive. You are just a pathetic, helpless weight dragging me into the gutter." The words struck Chloe like physical blows. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically, curling into a tight ball as the woman she had depended on her entire life verbally eviscerated her. Margaret didn't stop to comfort her. She turned on her heel, spitting a final curse of absolute disgust, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the framed pictures on the wall rattled. I sat in my penthouse, watching the golden child weep on the floor, experiencing the exact same soul-crushing, agonizing rejection that I had endured every single day of my childhood. The cycle was officially complete. Margaret had finally turned her toxic, narcissistic abuse onto the only person she had left, completely destroying the maternal bond they had used as a weapon against me. The illusion of the perfect family was entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but 3 miserable, hateful strangers trapped in a beautiful glass cage that I personally owned. I smiled, picked up my phone, and drafted an anonymous email to the city's fraud division regarding the destroyed counterfeit goods in the basement. The psychological torture was progressing perfectly, and the grand finale of their absolute destruction was drawing closer with every agonizing, miserable second they spent in my house. The oppressive, suffocating silence that hung over the $6 million Whispering Pines estate after Margaret's vicious, soul-crushing screaming match with Chloe was a palpable, living entity, a thick fog of pure misery that had finally seeped into the very foundation of my toxic family's fake, glamorous world. Sitting in the pristine, sunlit sanctuary of my penthouse office, I watched the high-definition security feeds with the cold, calculated patience of a grandmaster who had already cornered their opponent's king on the chessboard, waiting for the inevitable, catastrophic checkmate. It was 2:00 p.m. on a seemingly peaceful Thursday afternoon, the kind of beautiful, cloudless day where the ultra-wealthy residents of the gated community were usually out playing tennis or hosting garden luncheons. But inside the Harrison rental mansion, time had completely stopped. My father, Richard, was slouched on the expensive Italian leather sofa in the living room, staring blankly at a muted television screen, a half-empty bottle of cheap scotch resting precariously on the glass coffee table in front of him, having completely abandoned any pretense of being a functional, respectable patriarch. Upstairs, Chloe was barricaded inside her sprawling, empty suite, curled into a tight, trembling ball on the floor of her closet, traumatized not just by the terrifying omnipotence of my surveillance, but by the shattering realization that the mother she had worshipped her entire life viewed her as nothing more than a useless, disposable burden. The moment she stopped being a convenient accessory. Margaret, meanwhile, was frantically packing the kitchen, her expensive acrylic nails tapping a chaotic, anxious rhythm against the quartz countertop, completely unaware that the anonymous email I had sent to the city's fraud division exactly 5 hours ago was currently materializing into a real-world nightmare heading straight for her custom, double oak front doors. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the serene, exclusive quiet of the Whispering Pines neighborhood was violently shattered by the piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens. I zoomed in on the exterior driveway cameras, watching with profound, icy satisfaction as 3 marked city police cruisers, accompanied by a sleek, black, unmarked corporate SUV belonging to Phoenix Holdings, tore up the imported cobblestone driveway, their red and blue emergency lights reflecting off the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate. The sheer, public humiliation of the moment was absolutely glorious. I could see the wealthy neighbors stepping out onto their manicured lawns, clutching their pearls and whispering frantically to each other, permanently sealing the Harrisons' fate as the neighborhood pariahs. Mr. Vance, my terrifyingly efficient lead property manager, stepped out of the black SUV wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his face an unreadable mask of absolute, robotic professionalism, flanked by 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit. Inside the house, the sound of the sirens had triggered an immediate, full-blown panic attack. Margaret froze in the kitchen, the blood completely draining from her face, her eyes wide with a terror so profound she looked as though she were staring directly at the Grim Reaper. Richard practically fell off the sofa, stumbling toward the foyer just as a series of heavy, authoritative knocks hammered against the front door, a sound that echoed through the cavernous mansion like the beating of a war drum. When my father unlocked and opened the door, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the deadbolt, Mr. Vance did not wait for an invitation. He stepped across the threshold, his imposing presence instantly dominating the space, with the police officers filing in closely behind him, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. "Richard and Margaret Harrison," Mr. Vance announced, his voice carrying through the marble foyer with bone-chilling clarity. "I am here representing Phoenix Holdings, the legal owner of this property. We are executing an emergency, unannounced inspection under Section 12, Clause 4 of your lease agreement, which grants the landlord immediate access to the premises when there is credible, documented suspicion of illegal commercial activity. Furthermore, I am accompanied by detectives from the city's fraud division, who have received an anonymous, highly detailed tip containing photographic evidence that counterfeit luxury goods are being stored and prepared for illicit distribution within the basement of this estate." Margaret let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs. Her narcissistic brain, completely incapable of accepting responsibility, immediately began calculating a way out of the trap. She forced a sickly, trembling smile onto her face, stepping forward and attempting to project the haughty, untouchable aura of a wealthy socialite. "Officers, there must be some sort of ridiculous misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "We are the Harrisons. We are upstanding, elite members of this community. We certainly do not engage in anything as vulgar as counterfeit distribution. You are welcome to search the basement, but I assure you, you will find absolutely nothing but our seasonal decorations and old clothing." Margaret felt a sickening wave of false confidence wash over her, genuinely believing that because Chloe had shredded the bags into thousands of unrecognizable pieces the night before, the police would find no usable evidence of her intended crime. She had no idea that in the eyes of the law, and especially in the eyes of a corporate lease agreement, destroyed evidence was still evidence. The lead detective, a stern-faced woman who looked entirely immune to Margaret's fake charm, simply nodded and instructed two of her officers to proceed to the basement. I watched on the split-screen monitors, my heart beating with cold, rhythmic anticipation as the officers descended the stairs, opened the storage room door, and shined their flashlights onto the concrete floor. The basement looked like the site of a brutal, synthetic massacre. There were literally thousands of jagged, shredded pieces of fake leather, severed straps, and blatantly counterfeit faux gold hardware bearing twisted, fake designer logos scattered in a massive, undeniable pile. The lead detective walked back up the stairs 5 minutes later, carrying an evidence bag filled with a handful of the shredded counterfeit logos, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table in the living room. "Mrs. Harrison," the detective said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, accusatory octave. "While these items have been severely mutilated, they are undeniably counterfeit luxury goods. The sheer volume of this synthetic material indicates a commercial-scale operation. The possession of these goods with the intent to distribute is a felony, and the intentional destruction of this evidence strongly suggests a consciousness of guilt. Who purchased these boxes, and who brought them into this house?" The silence in the living room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum where the final, rotting threads of my family's loyalty were about to be permanently severed. I leaned closer to my monitors, watching my mother's face. For 18 years, she had protected Chloe at the absolute expense of my sanity, my happiness, and my basic human survival. She had thrown me into the freezing rain on my 18th birthday to give Chloe a larger closet. But now, faced with the terrifying, very real prospect of being handcuffed, dragged out of her rented mansion in front of her wealthy neighbors, and thrown into a concrete prison cell for fraud, Margaret Harrison's true, ultimate nature was exposed to the light. She didn't hesitate. She didn't try to take the blame to protect her child. She turned her panicked, tear-filled eyes toward the top of the grand staircase, where Chloe had crept out of her room and was standing on the landing, trembling in her bathrobe, watching the police raid in absolute horror. Margaret pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at her golden child. "It was her!" Margaret screamed, her voice echoing with a vicious, desperate betrayal that made my father physically recoil in shock. "It was my daughter, Chloe." "She is completely obsessed with designer brands, officers. We lost our money, and she couldn't handle the downgrade in her lifestyle. She must have ordered those disgusting fake bags online to try and impress her friends at the country club, and when she realized she might get caught, she panicked and shredded them in the basement. My husband and I had absolutely no idea she was doing this. She is troubled, she is out of control, and she brought this trash into our home without our permission." The absolute, soul-crushing devastation that washed over Chloe's face was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The golden child, who had spent her entire life believing she was the center of her mother's universe, was suddenly, violently pushed directly into the path of a speeding freight train so her mother could step out of the way. Chloe's mouth fell open, a silent scream of sheer agony trapped in her throat as she stared down at the woman who had just sold her out to the police without a microsecond of hesitation. She wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to yell that Margaret bought the bags, that Margaret planned the auction, and that she had only shredded them because the anonymous billionaire landlord had forced her to do it under the threat of exposing her break-in. But Chloe was completely, hopelessly paralyzed by the psychological trap I had built around her. If she told the truth about my blackmail, she would have to admit to felony breaking and entering into the owner's sanctuary, sending herself to prison anyway and instantly triggering the eviction. She was forced to stand there, tears streaming down her face, silently absorbing the catastrophic blame her mother had just viciously pinned on her. Richard finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Margaret, what are you doing? She's our daughter. Officers, please, don't arrest her. It's just a misunderstanding." But Mr. Vance, the ultimate executioner of my corporate will, stepped precisely between my parents and the police, pulling a fresh, red-stamped legal document from his briefcase. "The criminal liability of who purchased the counterfeit items will be determined by the Fraud Division's ongoing investigation," Mr. Vance stated, his voice completely devoid of empathy, cutting through the emotional chaos like a surgical scalpel. "However, Phoenix Holdings operates on a zero-tolerance policy regarding illicit activity. The undeniable presence of commercial-scale counterfeit materials on this property constitutes a catastrophic, incurable breach of Section 12, Clause 4 of your lease. The landlord has authorized an immediate, non-negotiable emergency eviction protocol. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, at which point the locks will be changed, and your prepaid yearly rent will be seized in its entirety to cover the reputational damages incurred by this police raid." My father collapsed to his knees right there on the imported hardwood floor, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot, realizing that they were officially, undeniably homeless. Margaret let out a horrific, guttural wail, grabbing Mr. Vance by the sleeve of his tailored suit, begging him, pleading with him to show mercy, screaming that they had nowhere to go, no money, and no family left to help them. Mr. Vance calmly peeled her fingers off his jacket, straightening his cuffs with robotic precision. "There is only one emergency provision remaining," Mr. Vance announced, delivering the final, devastating ultimatum I had specifically scripted for him. "The CEO of Phoenix Holdings is incredibly protective of the company's assets. If you wish to halt the eviction protocol and remain on the premises while the police conclude their investigation, you must post an emergency, non-refundable corporate liability retainer of exactly $50,000 by 12:00 p.m. tomorrow. Since your credit is non-existent, this must be paid via a certified bank wire. If the funds are not in our accounts by noon tomorrow, you will be physically removed from the property by armed security." The police detectives, having secured their evidence and issued formal subpoenas for Margaret and Chloe to appear for questioning, turned and walked out the front door, leaving the Harrison family standing in the ruins of their shattered lives. The sirens faded into the distance, but the silence that returned to the house was completely different this time. It was the silence of a family that had finally, totally cannibalized itself. Margaret sank onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands, weeping with a desperation so deep it bordered on madness. She knew they didn't have $50, let alone 50,000. She knew that every friend they had ever known had blocked their numbers. And as I watched her through the camera, a cold, dark smile spread across my face as I saw the terrible realization dawn in her eyes. She only knew one person in the entire world who had access to that kind of cash. She was going to have to go back to the towering glass headquarters of Phoenix Holdings. She was going to have to crawl on her hands and knees before the daughter she had thrown away, and she was going to have to beg for a $50,000 miracle. But this time, I wasn't just going to take Chloe's clothes. This time, I was going to take their absolute, final shred of dignity, and I was going to reveal the terrifying truth of exactly who owned the glass house they were trapped in. The morning of the final deadline arrived with a heavy, gray sky that seemed to press down on the city like a lead weight. And as I sat behind my massive obsidian desk at the headquarters of Phoenix Holdings, I felt a sense of cold, vibrating clarity that told me the 7-year cycle of my suffering was about to reach its absolute, glorious conclusion. At exactly 10:30 a.m., my assistant paged me, her voice trembling slightly with the sheer intensity of the drama unfolding in the lobby. She informed me that Richard and Margaret Harrison were back, and this time they weren't demanding an audience. They were literally on their knees in front of the security desk, sobbing and begging anyone who would listen for a final 5-minute meeting with the CEO. They looked like two hollowed-out ghosts who had crawled out of a fresh grave. I didn't let them wait this time. I wanted them to be at their absolute weakest, their pride completely evaporated, and their desperation at a fever pitch when they walked through those mahogany doors for the last time. When the doors finally opened, The sight of them was genuinely pathetic. My mother, Margaret, was wearing a rumpled, stained dress. Her hair was a matted mess, and her face was bloated from 48 hours of continuous crying. My father, Richard, looked like a man who had suffered a total psychological collapse. His hands were shaking so violently he had to keep them stuffed in his pockets, and he couldn't even meet my gaze. They didn't walk to the far end of the conference table this time. They stumbled across the room and collapsed onto the plush carpet directly in front of my desk, literally kneeling at my feet. "Maya, please," my mother wailed, her voice a hoarse, guttural rasp that didn't sound human anymore. "We are begging you. You are our only hope. The police are going to arrest Chloe. The movers are coming in 90 minutes to throw our things into the mud, and we have nowhere to go. We have no money left, Maya. Not a single dollar. Please, for the love of God, give us the $50,000. We will do anything. We will be your servants. We will never speak your name again. Just don't let us die on the street." I sat back in my chair, looking down at the woman who had once told me I was dead weight and a stain on the family reputation, and I felt a profound, freezing silence in my soul. I let them beg for 5 full minutes, watching as my father sobbed into the carpet and my mother tried to grab the hem of my silk trousers with her trembling fingers. When the clock on my wall hit exactly 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the wire deadline, I leaned forward, my face a mask of absolute, chilling serenity. "You want me to save you, Margaret? After you threw me out in the rain on my 18th birthday? After you called me a worthless failure and watched me starve for 7 years? My mother looked up, her eyes wide with a frantic, delusional hope. "I was wrong, Maya. I was so wrong. I love you. You were always my favorite. I was just trying to be tough so you would succeed. Look at how amazing you are now. It's because of us, Maya. We made you this strong. Please just sign the wire transfer." I let out a slow, dark laugh that made both of them freeze in terror. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a single, gold-embossed folder, the same one Chloe had found in the sanctuary. I didn't say a word as I flipped it open and slid the founding charter of Phoenix Holdings across the desk, placing it directly under my mother's nose. I watched as her bloodshot eyes scanned the document, moving slowly from the company name to the signature line at the bottom. The exact second she saw the name, Maya Harrison printed as the 100% sole owner and landlord of every property in the portfolio, the sound that came out of her was a low, agonizing moan of pure, universe-shattering horror. She staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically from the paper to my face as the terrifying reality finally, fully crashed into her brain. "You!" she whispered, the word barely audible. "It wasn't an anonymous corporation. It was you. You bought the house. You set the traps. You hired Mr. Vance. You were the one watching us the whole time." I stood up, my presence towering over them, and walked slowly around the desk until I was standing inches away from my mother's trembling form. "I didn't just buy the house, Margaret. I bought your debt. I bought your secrets. I bought your entire miserable life the moment you tried to crawl back into a rich neighborhood to hide your shame. For the last month, every breath you took in that mansion, every meal you ate on that quartz countertop, and every tear you shed in those empty hallways was provided by me. I wasn't watching you because I wanted to help. I was watching you because I wanted to see exactly how long it would take for you to destroy each other. And you didn't disappoint me. You sold out Chloe's entire life for a $25,000 fine, and then you threw her to the police the moment you felt a pair of handcuffs near your own wrists. You aren't a family, Margaret. You are a group of parasites who finally ran out of blood to drink." My father looked up at me, his face a mask of absolute broken shame. "Maya, please, we're your parents." I looked down at him with a look of cold, surgical pity. A parent doesn't watch their child sleep in a laundromat. A parent doesn't laugh when their daughter is homeless. You aren't my parents. You are just 2 tenants who are currently in incurable breach of their lease. I turned back to the desk and picked up my phone, pressing the speed dial for Mr. Vance. I didn't look at them as I gave the final command. "Mr. Vance, it is 12:01 p.m. The wire transfer has not been received. Execute the immediate physical eviction of the Harrison family from the Whispering Pines estate. Call the police to process Chloe for the burglary of the sanctuary. And Mr. Vance, make sure the neighbors are watching when you toss their trash bags onto the curb. Use the black ones. I want the aesthetic to be consistent." My mother let out a horrific, guttural scream, falling to the floor and clutching my ankles, begging me to stop, promising to do anything, but I simply stepped over her as if she were a piece of discarded litter. Security guards entered the room a moment later, firmly but professionally lifting my screaming mother and my weeping father off the floor and dragging them out of the boardroom. Their cries of "We're sorry" and "Maya, please," echoed through the hallway until the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, returning my office to a state of perfect, expensive silence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city I now partially owned, and I felt the final, heavy weight of my childhood trauma lift off my shoulders and evaporate into the clouds. An hour later, I opened the security feed for the mansion one last time. I watched as Mr. Vance and 4 uniformed officers walked into the house. I watched as they dragged a screaming, hysterical Chloe out of her bedroom and led her away in handcuffs for the felony break-in she couldn't explain. I watched as Richard and Margaret were led to the edge of the driveway, standing in the mud in front of their wealthy neighbors, while the moving crew tossed their boxes of cheap, mismatched junk into the street. My mother tried to scream to the neighbors that her daughter was a billionaire, but they just looked at her with disgust, thinking she had finally lost her mind from the stress of being a fraud. The locks were changed, the Phoenix Holdings security team took their positions, and the Harrisons were officially erased from the Whispering Pines community forever. They had no money, no home, no reputation, and now they didn't even have each other, as Richard walked away in one direction and Margaret sat on the curb in another, their toxic bond finally shattered by the weight of their own greed. I closed the laptop, took a deep breath of the filtered, mountain air of my penthouse, and walked toward my private elevator. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I wasn't the failure. I was the architect of my own destiny, the sovereign master of my own life, and I had finally, perfectly, and permanently balanced the scales of justice. The worthless failure was the only one left standing, and for the first time in my life, the ticking of the clock didn't sound like a countdown to pain. It sounded like the beginning of a long, beautiful, and silent peace. The city's skyline was draped in a soft, golden hue as I stood on the sprawling terrace of my penthouse exactly 1 year after the final eviction at Whispering Pines, feeling the cool evening breeze against my face and realizing that the silence in my life was no longer a sign of loneliness, but the profound, hard-earned peace of a woman who had finally silenced her demons. People often ask me if the revenge felt as sweet as I imagined it would be when I was sitting on that park bench in the rain 7 years ago, and my answer is always the same. It didn't feel sweet, it felt necessary, like a long-overdue surgery to remove a malignant tumor that had been poisoning my soul since birth. After the police raid and the absolute public execution of their reputations, the Harrison family didn't just drift apart. They disintegrated into 3 separate, miserable fragments of human wreckage. My mother, Margaret, whose entire identity was built on a foundation of fake status and narcissistic arrogance, couldn't handle the reality of being a common felon. Because the anonymous landlord, which was really me, refused to drop the charges for the lease violations and the commercial fraud, Margaret was forced to serve a mandatory 18-month sentence in a state correctional facility. I used my influence to make sure she was placed in a general population unit, far away from the luxury, white-collar prisons she had hoped for. I received a monthly report from the prison warden, and the details were a masterclass in karmic justice. The woman who used to spend 3 hours a day on her makeup was now wearing a rough, orange jumpsuit, scrubbing industrial floors with the same gray. Dirty water I used to use to clean our house as a child. She had tried to send me dozens of frantic, handwritten letters begging for a pardon or a private settlement, but I instructed my legal team to return every single one of them unopened, marked with a red stamp that read, "Sovereign Rejection." She was finally invisible, just like she had made me feel for 18 years. Chloe's fate was perhaps even more poetic. Because she was a first-time offender and my mother had so viciously pinned the blame on her, she avoided a lengthy prison sentence, but was ordered to complete 3 years of intensive court-mandated community service and pay massive restitution fines. Without her designer clothes, her rich friends, or her mother's suffocating protection, Chloe completely spiraled. I watched through a private investigator's lens as she moved into a cramped, one-bedroom basement apartment in a neighborhood she used to call the slums, working a minimum-wage job at a local grocery store, bagging the very items she used to demand my father buy for her. She had become the very worthless failure, she used to call me, forced to face the world as a plain, ordinary girl with no special status and no golden pedestal to stand on. She was finally experiencing the reality of hard work, but without the spark of ambition or the strength of character that I had used to climb out of the mud. As for my father, Richard, he simply vanished into the shadows of his own shop.